Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Taiwan Studies Program book talk for Professor Wendy Cheng. My name is James Lin. I'm an assistant professor of international studies and Taiwan studies here at the University of Washington, and associate chair of the Taiwan Studies Program. And for those of you joining online, thank you for joining remotely. So first of all, I will give an introduction to Professor Cheng, and then we'll turn it over. Before I do that, though, I want to mention that if you're here in person, University of Washington Press is just outside the door. They're selling copies of Dr. Cheng's book. It's with a discount code, so feel free to pick up a copy after the talk. David is very friendly, and we're very thankful that he's here with physical copies. For those of you who joined online, sorry you're missing out, unless I know you, in which case I'll buy a copy for you. Okay, Professor Wendy Cheng is Professor of American Studies at Scripps College. Dr. Cheng received her AB from Harvard University in English and American Language and Literature, her MA in Geography at UC Berkeley, and her PhD in American Studies and Ethnicity from the University of Southern California. She's author of The Chengs Next Door to the Diaz's, Remapping Race in Suburban California, University of Minnesota Press, 2013, which won the 2014 Book Prize from the American Sociological Association section on Asia and Asian America. She is also co-author of A People's Guide to Los Angeles, University of California Press, 2012, which won the Association of American Geographers Global Book Award for Public Understanding of Geography, and the SCIBA Nonfiction Award. So today she'll be giving us a talk about her brand new book, Island X, Taiwanese Student Migrants, Campus Spies, and Cold War Activism. Please welcome Dr. Cheng with a round of applause.
Thank you so much, James, for the invitation and for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you all here. It's a few familiar faces, some recently familiar. Okay. It's really great to be here. It's a really nice studio setup that you have too. So I'm going to jump right in, and I'd like to begin my talk today actually by reading a poem by my father, Edward Cheng, Zheng De Cang. And my father was a nuclear physicist, part of the generation of Taiwanese student migrants who I write about in this book. And he spent his career researching fusion energy. After he retired, he became the poet and the writer he had always wanted to be. So the poem I'm going to read is about, he wrote about his time in Madison, Wisconsin, as a young graduate student from Taiwan in the 1970s. That's him in his nuclear engineering office in 1976. And it's called Visiting Old Places to Say Goodbye to the Past. I returned to a place where life began to say goodbye to the past, recalling an era, the last of a memory. State Street in 1972. A very cold night after Christmas, we met a man with a face full of misery and talked with him for a while. 2 days later, we received a letter from him. My dear friends, you saved me. Last night, I wanted to end my life. Now I hope I can start a new life. Bless you too. Innocent us, we were confused and mystified. Now in 2004, much of the year has already passed. Those mysteries, that lost man and his new life, and the blessing he gave us then, after the relentless passage of time, it doesn't mean anything anymore. The memory has faded and become blank. In 1975, Saigon fell. The student newspaper said it was liberation. The students celebrated occupying State Street. They said they would change the name to Ho Chi Minh Street. Around that time, some students from Vietnam, sympathetic to Ho Chi Minh, came to visit this American imperialist campus, moving freely there, unthinkable, and accusing the American imperialists of invading their country. Thinking of memories from that time, new green buds sprouting on the trees, and apple blossoms and lilac blooming in the spring, more mosquitoes and gnats in the darker green of summer, and the ground covered with fallen leaves in the orange of autumn. Of course, there is also the freezing cold and white snow of winter. Memories of a snow country, those are the most vivid, are deeply embedded in my heart. Let's bury them. Instead, bring the expectation of spring with completely new hopes. Don't look back while boarding a vessel of fate headed toward an unknown destination. So I was really fascinated by these two stanzas in particular. And when I interviewed my dad for the research that eventually became my book, he brought this moment of encounter with Vietnamese students critical of the US up again. And so in the interview, he said, "I just wonder, how is it possible, because there was a war going on and these people are supposed to be the enemies of the US, how could they come to the US and then talk about how the US invaded them? This is unthinkable if you were in Taiwan." So I think this is probably how democracy and freedom thinking works, to allow this kind of contradictory but fantastic thing. So when I did a little more research on this, I realized that the moment my father remembers is also significant because the young Vietnamese man who spoke at the University of Wisconsin was likely a member of the Union of Vietnamese. The Union of Vietnamese was a US-based grassroots organization of Vietnamese individuals opposed to the war that was founded by students who had come to the US on US Agency for International Development, or USAID scholarships. The students' pro-US stance was assumed, and they had not been expected or intended to develop such a critique. However, as ethnic studies scholar Mei Fu puts it, their enrollment in US universities initiated the beginning of an unexpected political education. So this is actually a really great place and time to share this story, because concurrently right now there's a Southeast Asia symposium happening, and there's going to be a documentary about Nguyen Thai Binh, who was a member of the Union of Vietnamese and had, was a student at University of Washington, right? So that's happening this same afternoon. So I thought it was really amazing that, to read this introduction in that space. So this sharing of space on a US campus between two Asian student migrants, each expressing or developing his political views in a circumstance that was created simultaneously by US militarism and apparent US benevolence, right? Those two things at the same time, is an important window into Asian American political histories that are still relatively unknown, and was indeed, as my dad put it when I interviewed him, a contradictory but fantastic thing. And so actually this was the title of the article, and also the opening of chapter 1. The title of an article I published early in the process, and the opening of chapter 1 in the book. But if you only want to read the article and not the whole book, sorry, Mike, my editor, you can download it, the article, for free on my website, or read it in the book. So my book tells the political story of this generation of Taiwanese student migrants in the context of US-Taiwan relations and global Cold War history. Part 1 situates Taiwan in relationship to the US and provides an overview of the educational and social networks and how they served as a structure for political activism. I also discuss some less well-known, more radical and leftist strands that emerged from Taiwanese political activism during the 1970s and 80s in chapter 2. Part 2 looks at 3 specific cases of Taiwanese migrants, Huang Qiming, Chen Yuxi, and Chen Wenceng, who met with Kuomintang state violence, including arrest, imprisonment, and murder in the case of Chen Wenceng, on the basis of their alleged political activities while living in the US. In my talk today, I'll focus primarily on the content from chapter 1 to speak about the structure of student migration to the US and how the conditions for both activism and surveillance were created. So more than 100,000 student migrants came to the US from Taiwan from the 1960s to 1980s, mostly for graduate studies in science, technology, engineering, and medicine fields. And although coming from an authoritarian society that had been under martial law since 1949, many Taiwanese students quickly gained the courage to participate actively in the public sphere. And this is a map I made of the Overseas Taiwanese Political Publications special collection at National Zhengzi University in Taipei. And there are 71 publications expressing a whole spectrum of politics, and you're welcome to go into that map. It has summaries, brief summaries of the content of each publication in Chinese and English. And so these students coming from Taiwan very quickly started or joined Taiwanese student associations, and they created social and political networks across the US and reaching Canada, Japan, Europe, and South America. These are just a couple of the publications. And they created and circulated their own political publications within Taiwanese communities, but also boldly entered into mainstream spaces of dialogue. They organized mass protests and actions, and some even plotted revolutions through both peaceful and violent means. So on the left, there is Peter Huang Wensheng, a Cornell PhD student in sociology and a member of the World United Formosans for Independence, who attempted to assassinate Jiang Jingguo, who was then the vice premier of Taiwan in New York. And on the right is a large protest of Chinese and Taiwanese students and professors who were protesting the handover of the Jiaoyitai Islands from the US to Japan, right? So it was an anti-colonial and anti-militarist action that then had very complicated politics after that, right? But they were doing these kinds of mass protests. And so at the same time, the KMT was extending beyond Taiwan a very pervasive network of authoritarian supervision and control. And so I discuss in the book how the continuous oppression of arguably minor subjects, right? Often people who are not even leaders or that central to the organizations, but got involved just a little bit, right? Or took a leadership position in an association. Oppressing these arguably minor subjects became very central to the experience, identity, and political consciousness formation of this generation. And this is another interactive map that you can check out that charts out dozens of incidents of spying at universities across the US, as I said in James's class earlier, also at University of Washington. So we should go back and look at the details of what that one was about. So these cases were covered extensively by campus and local newspapers, and also to some degree by national and international media. So this is a KMT informant form that it's hard to read for those of you in person. But it was printed in the Daily Californian, UC Berkeley's newspaper, widely reprinted in many other university newspapers and other publications in the diaspora. And it's describing the situation at the campus, right? Total number of people on our side, total number of Chinese students, how many from Taiwan, how many from Hong Kong, what's the situation, who's the leader of the Chinese Student Association, what is their political position, what's the situation between the enemy and us, and so on, right? So they were gathering this kind of information at dozens of campuses across the US, systematically doing so. And these reports were part of a widespread ROC government surveillance infrastructure that they called the Cai Hong, or Rainbow Project. So named because Cai Hong is a homonym for picking or stamping out the red, right? The communists, who the regime constantly referred to as Gongfei, or communist bandits. So you actually see one of the categories on this number 14 is, number of those close to the bandits, right? Talking about the pro-communists. So being reported on could mean anything from intimidation, threats of injury or death, and harassment of family in Taiwan to being blacklisted from returning. Many cases culminated in arrest and imprisonment on return to Taiwan, as was the case with University of Wisconsin PhD student Huang Qiming in 1967. Chen Yuxi, an economics student at University of Hawaii's East-West Center in 1968, and those two are subjects of 2 chapters of the book. Rita Ye Daolei, who was a former PhD student in sociology at University of Minnesota, and Chen Zhanran, a UCLA PhD student in sociology in 1991. And then other cases culminated in death, as was the fate in 1981 of Carnegie Mellon professor Chen Wenzheng, who's the subject of chapter 5 of the book. In 1984, the KMT went even farther, ordering the assassination of author Henry Liu, Liu Yiliang, who had written an unfavorable biography of Zhang Jingguo. And Henry Liu was assassinated in the driveway of his Daly City, California home, right? So they actually committed this violence in the US and not in Taiwan. So historian Calvin Chengmiao points to such moments as evidence of what he describes as the growing convergence between domestic and foreign repression during the early 1980s, as the Reagan administration seemed to make exceptions for trans-Pacific acts of domestic terrorism committed by authoritarian, that is anti-communist, versus totalitarian, that is communist regimes, right? So they were permitting their allies to do these things because they wanted to share intelligence with them. They wanted to continue to share intelligence with them and maintain good relations. And so this was a slippery Cold War distinction that was explicitly calculated to support long-term US interests. So in the 1980s and 1990s, Ling Chi Wang, who was, I'll get back to that in a second, Ling Chi Wang, who became an important figure in establishing Asian American studies during that time, argued that the Chen Wenzheng and Liu murders were part of a longer history and structure of what he called dual domination, under which Chinese and Taiwanese in the US were both violently surveilled by the nationalist government and made vulnerable by their racial subordination in the US. So many Taiwanese students were were keenly aware of these multiple vulnerabilities and tried to protect newly arrived students from harm, as well as inform the broader public. So for example, in an incident at North Carolina State University in 1983, 2 members of the Taiwanese Student Association were arrested and charged with illegal advertising for hanging posters around campus that accused the vice president of the Chinese Association of being a spy. In a letter to the university administration, one of the 2, Pei Hongguo, expressed the political consciousness and tactical goals behind their actions. And he says, "The students I represent have learned that unless we stand up united behind one another, a historical tragedy will once again unfold before us. In this spirit, the main reason we hung posters around campus was to alert newly arrived students to the necessity of being cautious and on guard at all times, not to mistakenly think that we too are to enjoy the freedoms of America." And then he goes on, "We intended to appeal to the fairness of American friends and motivate them, in the tradition of the ideals embodied in the American Revolution," right? And so I was really interested in this because he was simultaneously calling out the failures and appealing to the promises of American ideals. During the 1960s, political scientist Douglas Mandel, who was then a professor at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and then later came to University of Washington. And so I actually looked at, his papers are in the special collections here and were a really important part of the research I did for chapter 3. I'll tell you more about that in a second. So Douglas Mandel, in this book, he estimated that up to 20% of Taiwanese migrants were politically active, and a majority of those involved in Taiwanese social organizations were sympathetic to Taiwan independence. And similarly, in a survey of Taiwanese students and professionals in 1970, Xu Yang Zhang found that anti-Zhang pro-democracy sentiment was widespread, and almost 1/5 listed escape as a reason for leaving Taiwan. So the story about Douglas Mandel that's in the book is chapter 3, the story of Huang Qiming, because Huang Qiming at University of Wisconsin, when he was at University of Wisconsin-Madison, he was Douglas Mandel's research assistant. And Mandel employed a lot of Taiwanese students to do the research for this book, because he himself could not read Chinese or speak Mandarin or Hokkien, so he was recruiting Taiwanese graduate students to do this research for him. So a lot of Huang Qiming's research is actually in this book, and the letters in special collections between Huang Qiming and Douglas Mandel that are letters that Huang Qiming wrote for, 1 or 2 letters a week for a long period of time, right? A lot of that research is still in there, and Huang Qiming's own insights, as well as correspondence about Huang Qiming when he was later arrested and imprisoned in Taiwan. And not to give away too much, but there's actually like a very tragic end to that case too, because after Huang Qiming was released from prison, he was not able to come back to the US, right? So he usually what would happen is, as soon as someone who was on the radar of the government showed up in Taiwan, they would get detained and they wouldn't be able to leave again, right? And that's what happened to Huang Qiming. But then later on, in the late 1970s, Douglas Mandel went to Taiwan to give a lecture, and Huang Qiming showed up and drove him to his lecture. And then after he dropped him off, Huang Qiming was killed, like run off the road in a mysterious accident, and which many people felt certain was the work of the Kuomintang, right? Because that was a way that political dissidents, he was not the only one to meet that kind of end, right? A mysterious car accident, being run off the road. So that story is told in chapter 3 of my book, and has a relationship to University of Washington because of Douglas Mandel. So to get back to this story that I'm telling you today, but I wanted to tell you the Douglas Mandel connection. So how and why did these students get politicized? And I found through my research and in-depth interviews with 30 Taiwanese who came to the US as student migrants that their politicization in the US took shape through 3 interrelated conditions. First, an anti-colonial or subaltern mentality. Second, tightly connected institutional and social networks. And third, greater access to written materials and freedom of expression. And I'll explain what I mean by each of these. So one key condition is that the motivations of these activists would not have taken shape in the way that they did if they did not tap into an existing anti-colonial or subaltern mentality. And subaltern just means the lower classes in a colonial society who are seen as different and excluded from power. In Taiwan's 400-year history, leftist Taiwan independence activist Shi Ming argued that Taiwan Yishi, or Taiwanese consciousness, emerged from a long history of anti-authoritarianism in Taiwan. He described this mentality as the tradition of resisting foreign invasion. This began with indigenous resistance to the Dutch in the 1600s and continued through the Qing dynasty and then into the subsequent periods of Japanese and Kuomintang rule. These struggles and sentiments, he argued, created a distinct people and culture over time. Similarly, in Formosa Betrayed, which was an important book for this generation that was passed around among these Taiwanese student circles, American diplomat George Kerr, who witnessed the 228 incident, described Taiwan under Qing dynasty rule in similar terms. So he says, right, there's a local Formosan tradition of resentment and underlying hostility. Every 3 years an uprising, every 5 years a rebellion, right? He quotes a Cheng saying about Taiwan. And so my interviewees really expressed these kinds of sentiments in their own words. So for example, Chen Cho-san, who came to the US as a graduate student in physics in 1962 and became a member of WUFI, the World United Formosans for Independence, he described this Taiwanese consciousness in this way, right? He said, it's an island always influenced by so many different outsiders, so it gradually formed its own identity. I think the poor fate of Taiwan makes Taiwanese even have to think more about helping Taiwan, because Taiwan is always under somebody's mercy, right? Japanese, Chinese, they rule us, they don't treat us equally. They give you a small benefit, then we are so grateful. Actually, that should be ours to start, right? Another interviewee, Li Yuanze, who later became a Nobel Prize-winning chemist, but who also came to the US as a student during this time period, he described the climate during his high school years in Taiwan in the 1950s. And he said, "This is the friction between the ruler and the oppressed, rather than Taiwanese and mainland Chinese. But mainland Chinese came as the ruler and the dominator," right? So he's talking about the mainlanders who came with the nationalist Chinese. And of course, that history is much more heterogeneous, right? It's not a uniform history, but they did, as Edmondson said, fill the same colonial structure that Japanese had just left, right? And for the most part, local Taiwanese were excluded from most positions of power. So Taiwanese who grew up immediately during or immediately after the transfer of power from Japan to nationalist Chinese rule observed these dynamics firsthand. So for example, my mother, Lai Su-ching, she grew up in a paper mill company town in northeastern Taiwan in Luodong. And in this context, Taiwanese workers were restricted to low-level jobs. The workers and their families lived in housing that was segregated, first from the Japanese and then from the nationalist Chinese managerial class. Her father, my grandfather, and he's there on the right, he had begun working at the mill, the paper mill, when he was 12, which was pretty common for his generation. And he told her how the Japanese management had simply been replaced by the KMT-affiliated Chinese management after the war. Although as a child she did not understand the details, her father taught her to cultivate a critical awareness of what was happening around her, particularly when it involved the government. And so she said, "I didn't know about politics, but my father was very outspoken at home. He was just very critical of the government. He always told me that when you read the newspaper, you should read it upside down. If they say white, it's black." So Taiwanese identity and consciousness were therefore deeply shaped by anti-colonial and subaltern identifications. As much as it had been suppressed under martial law, this sort of consciousness was present in Taiwanese students' life experiences and family histories by the time they arrived in the US. And the conditions and connections they encountered upon arrival gave these already existing worldviews every opportunity to grow into action. Educational networks were not only the condition for their migration, but essential to Taiwanese students' ability to connect with each other in the US. A substantial proportion going to the US had been top students since elementary school and were consistently grouped with other top students. The college entrance exam admitted only the highest scoring students into the medical schools and science and engineering departments at desirable universities such as National Taiwan University and Tsinghua University. I know we have a Tsinghua professor in the room with us. As a result, roughly the same groups of students were tracked with each other from junior high school on. Since there were few postgraduate educational opportunities in Taiwan at the time, continuing onward to graduate school in the US became so common that large portions of whole graduating classes, say in the physics department at National Taiwan University, would find their way to the US, to the point that a common saying during that time went, "Come, come, come to Taida, go, go, go to the US." The educational system in Taiwan was tailored for this purpose. English was taught beginning in junior high, and students were encouraged to specialize in skills needed in the American job market. Consequently, the US was by far the most popular choice for study abroad, and it received 90% of Taiwanese student migrants in the 1960s and 1970s. These students largely were the top students of their generation, and they were considered to be the future leaders of society, although they were often advised by their families to avoid politics for their own safety. So I think that's a really different way about thinking about science in Taiwan as it is in the US, right? So in the US, there's kind of the stereotype of, apolitical math and science nerds, right? Who don't have anything to do with politics. But in Taiwan, they were very much being groomed to be the future leaders, and they saw themselves that way as well. Okay, so the first Taiwanese student associations in the US were formed by graduate students and faculty at Midwestern universities in the early to mid 1960s. And so this is from the University of Wisconsin archives, the Taiwan 同学会, Formosan Club, one of the earliest ones in 1963. And just a little trivia there, James C.M. Huang is Huang Qiming, the subject of chapter 3, who I already mentioned, right? So he was the secretary of the Formosan Club. Okay, so, and the concentration of Taiwanese students in the Midwest, right? So if you talk to a lot of Taiwanese Americans, you may find that they have a Midwestern connection. And part of the reason that many local Taiwanese or Taiwanese identified students ended up in the Midwest is that many of them were coming from working class backgrounds and working or lower middle class backgrounds. And this stands in contrast with mainlander Taiwanese students who at that time were more likely to come from more class privileged backgrounds with more connections or ability to enroll at more elite universities in California and on the East Coast. So you see this kind of separation happening, or different kinds of concentration. So Taiwanese identified students were therefore clustering in larger numbers in these large public research universities in the Midwest, in which tuition was inexpensive. You know, sometimes they were offering, you know, resident tuition and financial support in the form of research assistantships, TAships, and so on, were more readily available. So a typical arrival story once the flow of student migration was underway shows how quickly and naturally Taiwanese students became involved with the Taiwanese student associations. And so this is Fanqing Liang arriving at Purdue in 1969, right? He says, first day, I remember when I arrived there, my classmate and her friend picked me up at the airport. I already had my dorm reserved. They helped me check in, and then they took me to pizza. It was the first time I had pizza. And then I asked him, you know, were you close friends with that classmate? And he said, no, not really, because the Taiwanese friends come here, they all get together and they have a group together, right? So as soon as people came, they would make directories and they would set up these kind of like mutual aid networks, right, to support people as soon as they arrived. And so another one of the big centers for Taiwanese identified students and that became a hotspot for the Taiwan independence movement was Kansas State University. And so Vivian Fu on the right arrived at Kansas State in the late 1960s. And she talked about the communal caretaking that Taiwanese students engaged in there as well. You know, she had no car, so she would just call somebody to give her a ride to the grocery store. And then on the days in the dorm when there was no dinner, she'd be invited to the married couple's house that would feed people, right? And so this is another example of the gendered kind of divisions of labor that some Taiwanese women really did not appreciate of this generation, right? A lot of the cooking, the caretaking, that social reproductive labor was done by Taiwanese women, many of whom were also students themselves, right? And some of them were very proud of what they did too, but some of them wanted to have other kinds of roles. But this was repeated in many different campuses, right? The classmates or sometimes there were Taiwanese professors there who were married, right? And they would serve as kind of like a host family, you know, for gatherings for the larger community. And so Vivian Fu felt that this closeness was a strong factor in why she developed a distinct Taiwanese identity for the first time soon after arriving in Kansas. So she had not felt that before, but by participating in these associations, she began to feel that more strongly. So one really important point is that the social was enfolding the political. They weren't separated from each other. So at university, for example, at University of Wisconsin in the mid-1970s, sociology PhD student Patrick Huang, Huang Zaitian, he lived in a rented house near campus with 6 other Taiwanese students. They rotated the cooking and exercised together every day, and they became a hub for the larger student community. They would do things like organize haircut days where you could come to the house to get a cheap haircut from a friend with some scissor skills. And this is learn to fix your car day. Yeah. So Huang was eventually inducted into WUFI, World United Formosans for Independence, and this came about through a friend of a friend who had loaned his car to help Huang move, right? So these conversations happened within these social networks. And then a few years later, Huang moved to New York, and he became one of WUFI's few full-time activists, and later a key member of the Taiwan Revolutionary Party. So the structure of the social organizations enabled activists to use them as both broad networks and concentric circles of increasing politicization. Social activities involving the outermost circle enabled the spreading of ideas and recruitment into the inner circles. So I think you can just read that, right? Casual participants, event organizers, independence activists. So that middle circle organized the events and discussed politics and tactics more openly. And then the innermost core circle, the smallest circle, were independence activists who organized the middle group. One activity that worked this way were the regional softball tournaments, and it served these multiple functions. Lin Wenzheng, who went to Syracuse University in 1973, felt that even the choice of the sport was subtly political in nature, as he expresses in this quote, and that it effectively attracted Taiwanese identified students who had been influenced by Japanese colonization prior to the arrival of the Kuomintang. So Japanese really inculcated baseball as a youth pastime in Taiwan in ways that had not been experienced by mainlanders who came to Taiwan later. Lin also realized that the core members of that innermost circle consciously used the softball tournaments to recruit and fundraise. The annual tournaments connected Taiwanese from as many as 10 universities across the Midwest and between New York, Toronto, Detroit, and Washington, D.C. And so Lin felt that the informal, flexible social structure of the softball gatherings made them a very powerful tool. And he said, if people just wanted to play softball and eat and enjoy the company of fellow Taiwanese, that was perfectly acceptable. Eventually, however, many repeat participants would become key members and leaders of the student association or the Tongshanhui, right? Either the community association or the student association. This informal social structure also enabled core members to filter out fellow students who might be spies. If someone behaved suspiciously, for example, suddenly asking questions about someone's personal background, people would alert each other, watch out for this guy. If you are with so-and-so, don't say anything against the government. So while they were mostly social, these types of regular gatherings created and strengthened activist networks for political events or activities, such as organizing transportation to protests and demonstrations in New York or Washington, D.C., or fundraising for political prisoners' families. The local and regional social gatherings created a sense of solidarity and nurtured the development of Taiwanese identity. They also strengthened the relationships and trust that were necessary for risky interactions, such as sending money to contacts in Taiwan and person-to-person communication of sensitive news and information. So the third and final key component of the development of anti-KMT Taiwanese consciousness was greater access to written materials, combined with more freedom of expression, coming from a society under martial law, and the active atmosphere of political protest in the 1960s and 1970s. Sometimes this was something student migrants had already anticipated and yearned for, to be able to read freely books that in Taiwan you had to risk your life to read, right, as one person described it. In addition to what they could read from libraries, students made, self-published, and circulated political magazines and journals via the Student and Community Association's contact lists. Some even went door to door to distribute them. And people who were reading them sometimes used chopsticks to turn the pages or to throw the material away because they were afraid of leaving fingerprints. In the late 1970s, Zhang Fusheng and Yang Yi, a married couple and members of the Taiwanese Association of America in New York, started a telephone line, Voice of Taiwan, Taiwan Zhiyin, which eventually had 41 local affiliates and could be called from anywhere to access recorded messages describing the latest political developments concerning Taiwan. And so Zhang Fusheng said, the way he described it, he said, I had gotten this idea from the fact that back then in the US, we could call a phone number at any time to get the day's weather. Does anybody remember calling the weather phone number? Yeah, I did it when I was a kid. The younger people won't remember, but you could call and then you get the weather forecast, a recording of the weather forecast. I used this service every morning and I thought it was very convenient. Voice of Taiwan became one of the most important and widespread means of communication among Taiwanese, both in and outside of Taiwan, and sometimes served as the sole or most timely carrier of news regarding urgent political events. So they were the first to report the Kaohsiung incident, and there's a recording, right, of them calling and talking to Linda Arrigo, Shimingde's wife, right? You can hear explosions in the background right from the scene of the protest. And those are those recordings are in the archive at the Usanlian Foundation. And there's a Taiwanese graduate student named Grace Ying who is doing detailed research about that. And I really look forward to when her work will come out. But these are these really great archival materials that are still at their house in Queens. Probably, hopefully they will send them to an archive soon. But these are, you can't see it very clearly. I think online you can, but these are instructions to affiliates in Toronto and Paris, instructing them how to install the technology, the tapes and the recording technology. Another example of this encounter with this atmosphere of political protest. In Chicago in 1969, John and Alice Yu, You Zhengbo, and Ceng Lingjun, who participated in starting the University of Chicago's Taiwan Tongxue Hui. They were really struck by the constant student sit-ins, strikes, and protests against the Vietnam War and activism for racial justice and civil rights, which was a huge contrast, again, after growing up in a country ruled by martial law. The trial of the Chicago 8, later known as the Chicago 7, that same year, 1969, made a deep impression on them, particularly Black Panther Bobby Seale's refusal to be silenced by the judge in the case. Eventually, Seale was bound and gagged in the courtroom and sentenced to 4 years in prison for contempt of court. As Ceng Lingjun put it, the willingness of protesters, including some of the most outstanding students, to speak up publicly against the government was eye-opening. And Taiwanese students themselves also quickly gained the courage to participate in this active public sphere, not only within Taiwanese communities, but beyond them. So they often submitted op-eds letters to the editor, to campus and local newspapers. In one incident, you can see a little bit of it on the left there at Kansas State. Taiwanese and Chinese identified students debated publicly for weeks in the campus comments section of the student newspaper after the visit of a speaker who praised the achievements of the KMT in Free China. And a collegian reporter said that this event caused more public reaction and comment than perhaps any speaker this year. The following month, a group of Taiwanese students took advantage of the collegian's paid advertisement space to memorialize the victims of the 228 incident, right? And this is a move that Taiwanese communities still do to this day, right? To publicize that history. And so to explain it to younger generations, I found that these back and forths in the letter to the editor section, they're kind of like how people use Twitter now or X, right? To like have those public arguments, right? That was the local public sphere that they were participating in. So these types of local scuffles, although they were most of them were relatively minor in themselves, within certain campuses. They really developed activist experience and prepared them for larger struggles in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when a number of significant events rocked Taiwan, including the release of the Presbyterian Church's Human Rights Declaration, there on the left, in 1977, the United States severing of diplomatic ties with Taiwan and establishment of relations with the People's Republic of China in 1979, the Kaohsiung incident in 1979, the Lin Yishuang family murders in 1980, and the death of Chen Wenzheng in 1981. So in response to these events, supporters used many of the same methods that they had developed in earlier campus and local struggles. So for example, after the Presbyterian Church of Taiwan published the Human Rights Declaration, Morgan Chang, Zhang Fusheng, arranged for his sister to smuggle the document out of Taiwan, to the US. And his poor sister, she didn't know that he told me that she didn't know that she was doing this, but luckily everything went okay. Yeah. So in addition to continuously broadcasting the declaration on the Voice of Taiwan, Zhang organized 68 members of Taiwanese American associations and churches to purchase a large advertisement in the New York Times calling for Taiwan independence, right? So from the university newspapers to the New York Times. After the Kaohsiung incident, Taiwanese American communities wrote op-ed letters to the New York Times and the Boston Globe and sent money to prisoners' families in Taiwan. They set up tables on campuses and at shopping malls to petition US Congress members for support. The Formosan Association of Human Rights, then headquartered in San Diego, organized a national speaking tour for activist Linda Gale Arrigo, who is the American wife of dissident Shi Mingde, and Arrigo had just been deported from Taiwan at that time. So at each of Arrigo's stops, Taiwanese community members notified the news media and mobilized Taiwanese Americans across the country to show up. So those networks, right? Those social and community networks were really brought into play at these moments. And these efforts contributed to successful international pressure for an open trial for the dissidents. So these examples show how by the late 1970s, local, regional, and national networks of Taiwanese Americans were well developed for trans-Pacific political activism, and core members had extensive experience organizing together by then. Even though they might move from one place to another, because of their similar educational qualifications and employment opportunities, they tended to cluster in the same places and could easily find one another. So in this sense, their selective conditions of migration in order to develop US geopolitical advantages in science and technology also worked unintentionally to create the social conditions for collective activism. So to conclude, many of the people I interviewed believed that they would not have become politically active in the same way if they had not come to the US. More than one person described themselves as an accidental activist. They believed that circumstances in the US allowed them opportunities to identify as Taiwanese, which they may not have had if they had stayed in Taiwan. The oppressive actions of the KMT toward Taiwanese, even in the US, also put people who were blacklisted on something of a one-way road. After they lost hope of returning to Taiwan while martial law continued, they felt they had nothing to lose by doing more. From the experiences and perspectives of this generation, it becomes clear that through practices of surveillance, intimidation, and threat, the KMT inadvertently built the infrastructure for their own opposition, encouraging native-identified Taiwanese to separate themselves from their Chinese-identified counterparts, and awakening a Taiwanese consciousness in some who had never previously felt strongly about such things. Taiwanese in the US were propelled by geopolitical forces and conditions beyond their control, excluded from most historical accounts, and still marginalized in historical scholarship. In spite of, or perhaps because of these facts, they built resilient social networks and organizations that affirmed their own existence and yielded political networks that asserted their right to choose their own identities and futures. However, while the US served as an incubator for the development of political activism oriented toward Taiwan, most Taiwanese migrants rarely questioned the role of the US, in particular of its central role in supporting the KMT and supporting and sustaining the authoritarian regime. While Taiwan has successfully become a democratic society, questions of sovereignty and independence remain unresolved, particularly since China has risen as a global power and continues to aggressively claim Taiwan as its own. Last year, when I gave a talk to the North American Taiwanese Women's Association, the NATWA conference, NATWA President Hilda Lin, Lai Hui-na, she said, there's never been any other generation like this. When we pass away, all of this will be gone. So for my generation of Taiwanese Americans and later, and for the larger world, I feel that we should ask this question, what legacy does this generation leave for future generations? As I hope my talk has shown, to be Taiwanese American is not a neutral descriptor of inherent characteristics, but formed out of specific historical circumstances. Internal historical conflicts and power dynamics continue to shape Taiwanese American communities in ways that are not always known or addressed, even within our own communities, much less recognized or understood by broader publics. Without fully addressing these legacies and complexities, though, Taiwanese American individuals and communities risk continuing to be shaped by historical circumstances of which we only have partial understandings. As Taiwanese Americans, I believe that our legacy is a beautiful one of incredible courage, resistance, and community, but also a complicated and unfinished one of sorrow, state violence, and multiple colonialisms, including an ongoing semi-colonial relationship with the US. It is, as my father, Edward Cheng, put it, a contradictory but fantastic thing. Thank you.
We welcome questions both from in person as well as from our online audience members. Dan.
Hi, I'm Dan. I'm from Seattle.
Cool. I was just there last week.
I'm really interested to hear more about like legacy of these organizations. So I feel like I'm wondering like how like the shift in Taiwan from governance, like how that shaped like organizing efforts and communities and networks and ties. A little outside the scope of what we're talking about, but I'm just wondering like if like you saw any change in that.
Yeah, so I think there is a shift in where the energies are. So up until the end of martial law, I think the communities in the U.S. felt like there was a lot that they could do to support what was happening in Taiwan. But after the end of martial law, there was a kind of a movement within some of these overseas organizations to, they called it like bring the party back to Taiwan, right? To go back to Taiwan and do the work in Taiwan. And so they chose to, many of them dissolved WUFI is still active today, but many of the other organizations dissolved and individuals then worked on other kinds of projects. So for example, one of the organizers of Taiwan Shidai, which was like a left pro-independence organization, after he went back to Taiwan, he decided to start the Green Party of Taiwan, right, as a way to keep pushing Taiwanese society to be more progressive and create an alternative to the Kuomintang. So that's one example, but it's not a simple answer, and each individual kind of chose different paths. So you can see that they all continue to kind of know each other, right, and be doing different kinds of things, but how they choose to do that differs. So there's no straightforward kind of continuation.
Oh, question in the back. Yes, go ahead.
I was intrigued by where you began with the anecdote about meeting with the Vietnamese activists.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, given all of the time that you're, was there very much solidarity with liberation in Vietnam and Central America?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I was very interested in myself, right? Because my training is in ethnic studies and Asian American studies, so part of this book was trying to put Taiwanese back into that global political history. And I think a lot of Taiwanese students were very interested in what was happening, but there were a couple things that prevented them from actually building relationships with non-Chinese speaking groups. One was language, so they were in this very vibrant, like Chinese speaking global political space, right? Interacting with students from Hong Kong, Chinese American students, reading political literature in Chinese, writing about political movements that were happening in all these publications around the world, and trying to make those connections in Chinese. But I think there are a couple moments. So Chen Yuxi, the University of Hawaii student who was surveilled, arrested, and imprisoned. Part of what got him on the radar of the Kuomintang is that he had participated in some anti-Vietnam War protests, and in Hawaii he became friendly with longtime labor activists and a very vibrant Hawaiian kind of progressive to radical movement of organizers. And so in his case, there was some of that crossover in that members of SDS supported him and advocated for him when he was imprisoned, right? So his story kind of touches some of that, but for the most part, there wasn't a lot of interaction. Peter Huang, who tried to assassinate Jiang Jingguo, he said he was inspired by a lot of that activism. But and then some of the members of the Taiwan Revolutionary Party did reach out to Tibetan and Uyghur activists in a bit later on. But I didn't see that strongly. And I think also it's because from the other side of it, Taiwanese students as ROC nationals were not legible to those groups either, right? So the historian Judy Wu wrote this great book called Radicals on the Road that was about a lot of these third world left movements that were interested in Vietnam and Maoism, and were traveling internationally to go to the PRC and so on, like Black Panther Party leaders and so on. So to them, students from Republic of China did not have that kind of that radical cachet, right? So I think even to this day, the broader U.S. public has very little understanding of Taiwan, and so I think that it also prevented those connections from happening in the other direction too.
Yeah. So I think I saw a question. Yes, go ahead, Dr. Lee.
Thank you for an excellent presentation, which seems to give me a review of the recent history. Some of the people I never heard of it. It's called Huang Qiming.
Mm-hmm.
I never heard of the story.
Yeah.
But anyway, since I also realize that you are an expert of the American study, so that in your presentation you mentioned about KMTs fighting on the campus.
Yeah.
And my question to you is that with your background, how about before asking the question, to me, I consider KMT almost equal to China or Chinese. So if KMT of Taiwan is able to fighting on the U.S. campuses for so many years, and eventually were revealed, how about current Chinese intention? Has U.S. government really pay attention to those Chinese spying on the campus? What's your opinion? And American studies, Professor.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So the question is about maybe contemporary equivalents to what we're seeing historically with KMT spying.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I don't study the contemporary period. I hope some people will. But what I can say is that there is a continuity to both the Kuomintang and the CCP spying on students on university campuses. So something really interesting that I found was that there's an article that I read about the Kuomintang and the CCP both spying on Chinese students in China in the 1930s and 40s, right? And so they were at that time, infiltrating student organizations and trying to create influence and find out information. And so the Kuomintang essentially brought that same structure with them to Taiwan, and then instituted that in universities in Taiwan and also the US. And I imagine that the CCP also continued to do that, So I know that there's a long history there, and we could probably learn a lot from studying those histories together. because I think one thing is, kind of sometimes people study Taiwan and ROC, Taiwan is ROC on one side, and they study the PRC over here, right? But they don't think about how those histories, the histories of those institutions are similar, and they actually have a longer history. So I don't have an answer to your question about the contemporary period, but I hope that if someone does look into that, they think about this much longer history of both Kuomintang and CCP, and how they use students and universities as a target for their political goals.
We have a question from online, which I'll read now. I wonder if you could share more insights on the transnational democratic activism in the US and Taiwan, specifically how people exchange their intellectual thinking on Western liberal ideology.
Western liberal ideology. I wish the person was here, because I would like to hear what they're thinking about, particularly when they say Western liberal ideology. I don't know if it would be possible for them to say a little bit more.
We might get a follow-up comment.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you're listening, go ahead and maybe elaborate. But I know from your book that you discussed, the one student who took a $99 Greyhound, visit all the libraries that you can in the US, and read all the banned works that were not available in Taiwan. So the Mao's book, George Kerr for Most of the Trade. So yeah, I mean, maybe that might be one example of liberal ideology.
So I think that
That's the
some word limit. Okay.
So something like democracy, civil rights, freedom of speech.
I see. Democracy, yeah. So I think they were definitely using those as tools for their goals, democracy, human rights, right? So, but I kind of question me personally as a scholar. So in the chapter about Chen Wenceng, I talk about how human rights, the focus on democracy and human rights was also sometimes missing the larger politics that they were trying to participate in, but because their immediate goal, the immediate goal of so many of this generation was to oppose the Kuomintang, right? Sometimes that focus on democracy and human rights was enough for them, even if they had very different politics in other regards, So I would say that it was, for a time, a set of tools and goals that made sense for them, right? But sometimes made for strange alliances, among people who had very different ideas of what how a society should be organized, or what it should look like, right? So I feel like those questions in that transnational political history are still, still can use more exploration. And that I saw that there was quite a big spectrum of what many student activists hoped for, that was beyond these kind of like liberal values, right? But that for that time, the focus on those particular goals was useful for them. Yeah.
Other questions? If not, we have one more. Oh, go ahead.
This question maybe is better for you to answer it later. That's up to you. You're probably familiar with the book?
Yes.
And I found this fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned things that I just was unaware of. Because I lived 4 years high school there, but I was 13 to 18. So my Chinese friends, when I talked to them, they said they were unaware too. What did you think of this? I know it's a novel. Would you call it historical fiction or?
Yeah, so the question is about Shauna Young Ryan's excellent book, Green Island, and what are your thoughts about it?
Yes, I would definitely call it historical fiction. I think it's really well researched, and it's probably one of the best creative interpretations, right, of that history. And it's very intentional on her part, I think, right? So the main character is actually born during the 228 uprising, right? And then it follows that main character and their life and family into the US, where this this transnational surveillance by the Kuomintang is part of what is happening to the family in the U.S. and the circles that they're in. So I think it's a really effective way of reaching a wider, sharing that story with a broader audience. And I actually use it to teach. Yeah, so about halfway through the semester when, everyone's energy is kind of dipping, we read that, and then because it brings people in to help imagine, to bring their feelings and their own sense of experience, into that. So I think it's really well done, and actually one of the few books out there that is really richly engaging with that political history.
We have one question from online. Could you say a little about the Taiwanese students who became more leftist, even communist, while in the US? How did they end up going in that direction, and what happened to them?
Yes, so this is the subject of chapter 2, and which is called A Blacker Blacklist, right? Because to be both, to be communist was even worse, right? So one of the people I interviewed for chapter 2, Lin Xiaoxin, who is one of the leaders of the Baodiao movement, he was a local Taiwanese Benshengren who got involved in that. And he, so for some people, the blacklist was like it was for my father, who was just told, don't come back to Taiwan, there's no job here for you, right? Kind of that like informal knowledge from a government agent. But for Lin Xiaoxin, his passport was confiscated for becoming involved in the Baodiao movement, right? So he actually ended up living as a stateless person for 13 years because he also was critical of the US and he did not want to apply for asylum in the US, right? So he lost his PhD fellowship, right? And he had to rely on the support of Taiwanese communities in the US, right? So people would pool funds for him so he could pay his rent and have, some basic money to live for during that whole time while he was living stateless. So that's one example. I think, others, some of them, some very famous writers, who became involved in the Baodiao movement, they ended up staying, they actually visited the PRC, right? And ended up staying in the US for a long time, but they kind of get left out of the history of that is much more focused on the Taiwan independence activists. And I also write a little bit about people who are both left and pro-independence. I think the contemporary political situation makes that really hard for people to wrap their heads around. But there were people who were also advocating for a socialist future for an independent Taiwan. And one of them I had mentioned briefly, right? The way that he chose to continue pursuing that was to be one of the founders of the Green Party of Taiwan. So there wasn't any one thing that happened to them, right? It kind of depended on what their particular choices were, but a lot of different things happened to them. And again, I hope that more will be written about those different trajectories, because I often, especially growing up in like a local Taiwanese family versus mainlander Taiwanese family, often those histories are not told together, right? Where actually their politics, they were figuring them out together, And so in my book, I try to start breaking that down, but it's only a beginning. And I think a lot more needs to be done.
Can I ask you a question about the island X?
Yes.
How far we know with that X? Yeah.
Yes, so we have George Kerr to thank for that. So he was actually working, he was a naval attaché, and so he was working on a secret project with probably General MacArthur, housed at Columbia University during World War II, when the US was planning to invade Taiwan, as a colony of Japan. And so they called it Island X because it was confidential. And they ended up changing their plans and invading the Philippines instead, right? But I find it a very useful metaphor for how the US has always been used, how Taiwan has always been used by the US for strategic purposes, right? So kept in ambiguity. And that's one of the main things that I want people who read my book to think about.
So the X is from George Kerr.
Yes, yes, yeah, that term, Island X. Yeah.
No. Let me also tell you a history about George Kerr.
Mhm.
George Kerr, right?
Yeah.
His original betrayed Taiwan. The original manuscript was on UW campus. He himself gave the manuscript to a professor, Taiwanese professor, Xiao Chen Mei professor. He was a full professor of neuropathology on campus maybe for 40 years.
Mhm.
But he passed away about 5 years ago.
Mhm.
George Kerr gave the original manuscript to him. He kept it.
Mhm.
But eventually, the Professor Xiao donated the original manuscript to Taiwan's 228 museum.
Oh,
Just name
I
the
see,
story.
I see. Yeah, but it's been some time
Taiwan
here.
and, associated with, closely associated with the UW.
George
Great.
Kerr was at UW for a while.
Uh-huh.
If you go to the Burke Museum, the Taiwan Indigenous collections, many of those collections were donated from George Kerr.
Wow.
Yeah, so he
Interesting.
was very interested in Amis Pancha culture, and so if Junyi and Margaret are not here, but if you know either of them, they will gladly tell you their background. They help curate the Burke collection on Taiwan Indigenous artifacts. So if you're local, check out the Burke Museum and see a little bit of the intersection of Indigenous history and George Kerr history.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
I would love to.
Okay. Any more questions from our audience or Jonathan also has something to add on this. Kerr's work is at the Taipei 228 Memorial Museum, also at the Okinawa Prefectural Archives.
Mhm.
I did not know that,
Yeah.
as well as the Hoover. Yeah, thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the sharing. Regarding the Li Xiaoxin, because he actually donated the document to Tsinghua.
Yes. Yeah.
That moment, I'm the director.
Oh.
And one thing comes to my mind is about that, because this kind of Taiwan activity is missing. But because KMT is kind of supporting government, so put the KMT as a topic.
Mhm.
So Taiwan identity become a way against government.
Mhm.
It's about democracy. It's about human rights and also about Taiwan independence.
Mhm.
So in your study, time for those students, they get together in their deep heart, looking for identity, but what are the proportion of their optimal goal? Is for independence or for the democracy or for human rights?
Mm.
Can we see that kind of proportion?
I think it depends on the person. So I think that most of the people I interviewed did feel a historical injury of not being able to claim their own identity, the identity in their hearts, right? That some other identity was always being imposed on them. So I think that was very strong. And so for the other things, yeah, it really depends. I'm trying to think if I can think of some good examples as ways to answer that. Yeah, and so I think some people like Lin Xiaoxing or especially on the left, right? Some of them actually independence, especially Lin Xiaoxin, right? Independence is not his goal. And I think some of the others I talked to said that as well. They said self-determination is their goal, right? They think that Taiwanese people should be able to decide their own future, right? And this is what has been denied to the majority of people in Taiwan over and over again, right? So maybe that's one way to answer it. Yeah, so actually surprisingly, not all of them were like saying independence is the only way, right? Some of them, especially the ones who don't live in Taiwan anymore, right? They kind of say, well, we just want Taiwanese people to be able to decide for themselves.
So I have a question. I'm thinking about this experience, like kind of a political trauma.
Mhm.
It's like this kind of political trauma influence their senses. I think now it's
Mhm.
from your interviews.
Yeah, so Hilda Lin, who I mentioned at the end, Lai Huina, the one of the former presidents of NATWA.
Let me just repeat the question real quick, because I think it
course,
didn't
yeah.
come through. So
Yeah.
the question is about political trauma affecting, did that come through in your interviews? Go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah. So the other thing she said when she said, when this generation passes away, all of this will be gone, right? Because it was such a unique historical moment that they lived through, and participated in the circumstances of that generation. Because even like 1 or 2 generations later of Taiwanese is a very different kind of experience, right? Post-martial law, different kind of political circumstance. So she did also say, Taiwanese, the second generation inherited the experience of suffering from their parents. Yeah, so I don't know. So I'm second generation Taiwanese, and I think for some of us who really paid attention to our parents, some people don't really pay attention to their parents, or their parents don't talk to them, right? But for those of us who are really paying attention, there is that sense of they did something really important. They were participating in something really important that is unfinished, that still needs to be told. That there is that sense of urgency to it. But I don't know. I think a lot of second generation Taiwanese Americans don't have that feeling because they don't really understand the history, So I think also for me, I should say that the process of researching and writing the book was a process of learning, but also unlearning, because I only learned part of that history growing up in very green pro-Taiwan independence circles. I didn't learn about indigenous Taiwanese. I didn't think about Han settler colonialism and what that means for Taiwan, And so I've learned so much from Taiwanese people in Taiwan, and especially my generation and younger in Taiwan who have grown up in a different time, So what some young Taiwanese Americans said in their podcast, which I thought was really true, they said, our parents' generation is kind of stuck in the moment that they migrated, and there are reasons, right? Because of trauma, right? Because they had to go through so much, because they fought so hard to oppose a government that is still in power, So that sense of an unfinished goal, but they also achieved so much, was my point. Yeah, so I think it's dangerous to only inherit the suffering, without learning. And so I feel very grateful that I was able to do some of that for myself and as a scholar in this book, and I hope that more people will participate in that, right? Because trauma in itself is not enough to reach for something good, right? It's a starting point, but you can't really only focus on your own trauma without thinking about the whole picture.
Yeah. Just a citation from one of my greatest mentor. She said, Colina Waters. She said that we live in yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, Susan, please.
Just mentioned this just a few minutes ago on my concept of colonialism. I'm curious if there were critiques of concept of colonialism as student activism. You mentioned connections, some connections with Spedians, Weavers, this whole anti-colonial movement. I wonder if there was more of a quote unquote internal reflection as well. I also wonder if there were indigenous student activists that might have.
Yeah. So the question is, were any of these activists involved in a more kind of self-aware critique of Han settler colonialism, as well as the second question is, were there indigenous student activists?
So I think for this generation of student migrants, most of them did not really have that awareness, right? Because they were so focused on being able to claim being Taiwanese for themselves, and fighting to assert Taiwanese-ness as a distinctive thing in itself. And I also, as far as I can tell, there were also very few indigenous Taiwanese that were coming in this generation, which makes sense in terms of like access to higher education, you know, and things like that. Some of the groups on the left, though, did have some awareness and invited, you know, in the 80s, Lin Xiaoxin was organizing these like Midwestern summer camps where a lot of activists were coming from Taiwan, and some of them were indigenous leaders and activists during that time. Also, the Taiwan Revolutionary Party, at least according to Linda Arrigo, they were also doing political education, and some indigenous Taiwanese leaders did pass through their spaces as well. You know, so I think some of the groups on the left had that awareness and were trying to build those connections. And of course, Green Party Taiwan has been pretty good about that, in my understanding. So I think there's kind of like a sub-history of, you know, people who were aware of that, but the mainstream, at least the mainstream Taiwan independence movement during this time period did not have much awareness of that, as far as I could tell. Yeah.
All right, other questions?
Well, 5 minutes ago, you said a learning lesson is very important. So I want to repeat my previous question. Taiwan KMT spying on the US. Has United States government learned anything new from Chinese approach, not spying on technology or military information? Okay, to that. But has that US government learned a lesson?
Might be the wrong person to ask. Yeah.
I have not learned anything new about that in the past 5 minutes, no.
Yeah, it might be, we might need to get someone with security clearance to ask. That'd be the right person to ask.
Yes, I would really like to know the answer, but yeah.
Yeah, Dan, was your hand up? Yeah, Dan and then Susan.
I also wanted to ask if more if you could like go into like the political like fissures that would like kind of go on in the student activists. So like you mentioned a bit about like how they're like I wonder if like white students like involved in it and how they navigated that sort of distinction.
Yeah. You want to repeat it for?
Yeah, so are there any fissures?
Fissures.
Or just like it's kind of just like asking about how do they navigate like the political difficulties of kind of having a unified group given the differences.
Dan, you might have to elaborate on that. I don't. Do you?
From what I understand, it's a question about 本省人 and 外省人, you know, and who was participating in what kind of politics, you know, what kinds of divisions emerged, right? Something like, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So I think this is a great question. And again, one of those parts where I think more needs to be done, because my book was really centrally focused on 本省人, you know, most of whom became Taiwan independence activists. But what I noticed when I did the research is that that ethnicity did not equal politics, you know, especially in that earlier time period. And so also that it wasn't something, so because of the way that the educational networks worked, you know, those top scoring students were both 外省人 and 本省人, right? And so, and they had close connections to each other, right? Many of them had been friends, you know, going to school together. And so sometimes coming to the US was the moment when they began to feel different from one another, right? Feel their allegiances pulled and identities pulled in different directions. So I do think there's something about the 本省人 identity that gets really solidified in the US because of the surveillance and, you know, and the way that those student associations were policed by the Kuomintang, right? So that identity started to become more equated to politics. And then the Baodiao movement is really interesting. It was just part of what I write about. I don't write centrally about it. Other people have done a better job, but that's a good example where they're both 外省人 and 本省人 initially, right? And then they go in different directions, right? But some 本省人 become pro-PRC, and then 外省人, because I didn't interview a lot with those backgrounds, I couldn't say anything very like, I can't really go in depth with that, but I know that there are 外省人 that were also in these political circles. So for example, Rita Ye Daolei, the former University of Minnesota student who's also arrested and in prison, she was a mainlander who was suspected of being a communist, but also very involved with these left pro-Taiwan independence circles, And so I really wanted to write a chapter about her case, but I couldn't find her because she went to Europe and she has mostly stayed in Europe. And so I was starting on that, but I couldn't really make more of it. But I think there's a lot more to be done there. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Susan, you had a question.
I was wondering about the different group dynamics within student activism. I guess tangentially alongside, I was really curious when you mentioned the students' involvement or their witnessing of racial justice movements in the US at the time.
Yeah.
I wonder if there was any sort of inspirations between these two, if there were reflections on ethnic group dynamics, racializations, or maybe just how the students interpreted what was going on in the US.
Okay. So the question is about whether there was awareness about ethnicity or racial movements in the US at the time.
Yeah. I think it didn't come up a lot in the interviews. And partly it's because there was so much happening in the Sinophone spaces, and they were finding their way within those. And then, my answer to the previous question, right, that there were ways that they were not able to connect or be connected to, among those different groups. So I just got these moments, right, where they're in the same space, or one person participates in an anti-Vietnam War protest, or one person is inspired by Bobby Seale, or that moment of actually the case at University of Hawaii was really interesting because it brings together a lot of these issues, because Chen Yuxi was a student at University of Hawaii's East-West Center, which was founded the same year that Hawaii became a US state, as an instrument of US cultural diplomacy, right? To celebrate Hawaii as this crossroads of East and West. And so a lot of students who came to the East-West Center were then being politicized by opposing the war in Vietnam, right? There were helicopters, Hawaii was a staging ground for the war, but in the classroom, they weren't allowed to talk about things like that. They were talking about kimonos and, agriculture. Well, agriculture we know is also a very important part of this. And so a lot of students were being politicized in the East-West Center. Again, an unintentional space of interaction where different kinds of things were happening. And some of those were white American students. For example, the person, John Wittek, who started Students for a Democratic Society, and became an advocate for Chen Yuxi after he was arrested and imprisoned. And so freedom of speech, a lot of the things that were part of the broader civil rights movement were definitely part of his case, because in Hawaii, those kinds of interactions were happening and possible, So you just see glimpses of it, but it's not a strong thread throughout, the typical experiences. Yeah. Thank you.
Maybe one last question. We only have about 1 minute left. So a quick question if we want to wrap up. Going once, going twice. Okay, if not, then let's give a round of applause. Thank you so much, Professor Cheng. That was lovely.